Friendster should have owned the entire social networking category before Facebook or MySpace ever got the chance. It launched in 2002, years ahead of both, founded by Jonathan Abrams, and it quickly became the first big social networking site to genuinely catch on with millions of real users. By 2003, it was growing so fast that, according to widely reported accounts from the time, Google itself reportedly offered to acquire Friendster for around $30 million, a serious sum for a company that young, and Friendster turned the offer down, betting its own independent growth would be worth far more. For a moment, Friendster had exactly the position every startup dreams about: first mover advantage, a genuine network effect already locking users in, and an acquisition offer from one of the most powerful companies on the internet. Then it collapsed under the weight of its own popularity. As Friendster's user base exploded, its underlying technical infrastructure simply could not keep pace with the traffic that success was generating. Pages that had once loaded in an instant began taking 10, 20, sometimes 30 seconds just to appear on screen. Multiple retrospective accounts from engineers and journalists who covered the collapse point to fundamental architecture and database problems, the kind of foundational technical debt that gets easy to ignore when a product is small and brutally expensive to fix once it's carrying millions of active users. This is a well-known pattern in the startup world now, sometimes called premature scaling, building a product's early features and growth marketing faster than the underlying technical foundation can actually support. And it remains one of the most commonly cited reasons early-stage startups fail, even after finding real product-market fit. Users who had joined specifically because their friends were already there found the actual daily experience of using the site becoming steadily more painful. Right at the exact moment the network effect should have been locking them in for good instead of pushing them away. Competitors launched later with cleaner, faster infrastructure built from the ground up for the scale Friendster was already visibly struggling under, and users migrated away almost as quickly as they had originally joined. Friendster's own leadership, by most accounts, was focused heavily on new features and aggressive growth marketing during this period, while the unglamorous, invisible engineering foundation underneath, the product quietly became the actual bottleneck holding the entire company back. Several companies that came after Friendster clearly learned this exact lesson and built their entire early growth strategy around it. Gmail famously launched invite-only in 2004, deliberately throttling its own growth for over a year so its infrastructure could keep pace with demand, instead of buckling under it the way Friendster's had. Clubhouse used a nearly identical invite-only waitlist strategy when it launched years later, explicitly to control server load while the product scaled, a strategy that would have sounded unnecessary before Friendster's collapse made the risk of skipping it so visible. Friendster never fully recovered its position in the West. It eventually pivoted entirely into social gaming, finding real, sustained success in parts of Southeast Asia under new ownership, before shutting down its original social network product for good in 2015. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone running a fast-growing team or product today. Being first to a market, or even being first to real, demonstrated user love, guarantees absolutely nothing if the operational infrastructure underneath the product can't support the exact success the product itself is generating. Rapid growth doesn't just test a product's popularity. It tests every unglamorous system quietly running underneath that popularity, the parts nobody in a leadership meeting ever asks about because they're invisible right up until the moment they fail in front of paying customers. A team can build something people genuinely, enthusiastically want, and still lose the entire opportunity if the boring parts, the servers, the databases, the systems nobody notices until they buckle, aren't scaled to match demand before that demand actually shows up at the door. This isn't a lesson that only applies to server infrastructure at internet companies. Any team that suddenly wins new customers faster than expected, takes on more clients than its support staff can realistically handle, or lands a viral moment before its fulfillment process can absorb the volume, is living through a smaller, less famous version of exactly what happened to Friendster. Picture a small restaurant that suddenly goes viral online overnight. The dining room fills with customers, but the kitchen was staffed and stocked for a normal Tuesday, not a citywide rush. Orders back up, food quality slips under pressure, and many of the new customers who showed up specifically because of the hype leave with a bad first impression instead of becoming regulars. The viral moment itself, the thing that should have been a huge win, becomes the exact event that damages the business, purely because the kitchen's capacity never scaled to match the dining room's sudden demand. The success itself becomes the crisis, and the crisis arrives disguised as good news, which is precisely why it's so easy for a leadership team to miss it happening, until customers are already leaving over it. What's genuinely worth noting here is how little correlation there was between Friendster's product idea and its ultimate failure. The core insight, that people wanted to connect and share with friends online, was completely validated. Facebook and MySpace both proved that same insight could build enormous, durable businesses. Friendster's failure says nothing about whether the idea was good. It says everything about whether the unglamorous operational foundation kept pace with an idea that turned out to be right. So here's the concrete, usable move for any manager or founder watching early growth numbers climb faster than expected. Before celebrating fast early growth in any meeting, ask your engineering team, or your operations team, or your fulfillment team, directly and explicitly whether the infrastructure underneath can survive 10 times the current volume without falling over. If the honest answer is no, that gap is the actual emergency hiding inside your good news, and it deserves the same urgency as any customer complaint on your desk right now. Friendster reportedly still had somewhere around 90 million registered users by 2008, even deep into its technical struggles, which shows just how strong the underlying demand for the product really was despite the daily frustration of actually using it. After its pivot into social gaming under new Asian ownership, Friendster reportedly grew past 100 million registered users in that entirely different market, proof that the same team, the same brand, and largely the same underlying idea could still build something enormous once the infrastructure actually matched the ambition. Engineers who later wrote publicly about Friendster's original technical struggles pointed to inefficient database queries and an architecture that had never been designed to shard or distribute load across many machines, the kind of foundational choice that's cheap to make early and brutally expensive to unwind once millions of users are already depending on it every day. Rebuilding that foundation reportedly took the engineering team over a year of sustained effort, an entire year during which competitors with cleaner architectures kept closing the gap and eventually overtaking Friendster's early lead entirely. It's worth being fair to Friendster's engineers here too. The cloud computing infrastructure that makes rapid, elastic scaling almost routine today for any modern startup, on-demand servers that can multiply in minutes as traffic spikes, simply didn't exist yet in any accessible form when Friendster was fighting this exact battle in 2003. Amazon didn't launch its own cloud computing service until 2006, years after Friendster's traffic problems had already done irreversible damage to its reputation, which means Friendster's engineers were solving a genuinely harder problem, with far fewer tools, than almost any team facing a similar growth spike would face today. That context doesn't undo the business outcome, but it does sharpen the actual lesson. The tools to survive a traffic surge are far more available today than they were in 2003, which means there's far less excuse for a modern team to get caught the way Friendster did, and far more reason to actually use the tools that exist before a crisis forces the issue. Modern engineering teams describe the ability to keep working, even in a degraded but still functional way, under unexpected load as graceful degradation, deliberately designing a system so that if one part gets overwhelmed, the rest of the product still limps along usably instead of the whole thing collapsing at once the way Friendster's pages did. Here's a concrete load testing habit any manager overseeing a product launch or a big marketing push can borrow directly from this story. Before any campaign or launch you expect to drive a surge in demand, ask your technical or operations team to specifically simulate 10 times your expected volume ahead of time, not just plan for the number you're hoping for. If that stress test reveals a breaking point below your realistic best-case outcome, that's the actual risk sitting inside your own success. And it's far cheaper to fix in a planning meeting than in front of the exact customers your growth was supposed to win over. There's a reason this specific failure mode keeps recurring across very different industries, not just internet startups. Whenever a team's marketing, sales, or growth function operates on a faster feedback loop than its operations or engineering function, the growth side will keep winning new demand faster than the operational side can safely absorb it. And nobody on the growth side has the visibility, or often the incentive, to slow down and let operations catch up. The growth team is measured on growth. Slowing that growth down, even temporarily, looks like failure on their own scorecard, even when it's exactly the right call for the business as a whole. Friendster's own leadership in that sense wasn't unusually careless. They were operating inside an organizational structure common to almost every fast-growing company, one where the function generating demand has faster, more visible feedback than the function that has to actually deliver on it, and where nobody's individual incentive is to be the person who says slow down. Naming that structural mismatch explicitly in your own team before a growth spike arrives is a far more reliable fix than hoping the people closest to the demand side will voluntarily throttle their own success metric on your behalf. It's also worth noting how much of Friendster's advantage was real and durable at the moment it collapsed, since that's the detail that makes this story sting rather than just inform. Friendster wasn't fighting for survival against a superior competing idea. It had millions of genuinely loyal users, a real product people wanted, and a head start most startups would consider unbeatable. It lost that position entirely to a problem that had nothing to do with product-market fit and everything to do with whether the unglamorous infrastructure work happened on schedule. That's precisely why this case belongs in the same conversation as MySpace and Toys R Us, rather than filed away as a simple technology story. In every one of these cases, a company with a genuinely strong, validated position lost that position for reasons entirely separate from whether the underlying idea was good. The idea being right is necessary. It has never once, in any of these three stories, been sufficient on its own. The practical habit worth taking from Friendster specifically is this. The moment any part of your business starts winning faster than you expected, treat that as a trigger for a specific, scheduled conversation with whoever owns the operational side of delivering on it, not as a reason to simply celebrate and move on to the next growth initiative. The team that wins too fast for its own foundation to support it rarely gets a second chance to fix the foundation once customers have already started leaving over it. It's worth being explicit about what this actually looks like inside a normal planning meeting, since the theory is easy to agree with and easy to forget under real deadline pressure. When a marketing or sales leader proposes a campaign expected to significantly beat prior targets, the standard question in the room is almost always some version of "can we afford this?" meaning budget. The question this story argues for adding, every single time, is a second one. Can we actually deliver this at the volume we're hoping for? Asked directly to whoever is responsible for delivery, and treated with exactly the same weight as the budget question. Friendster's leadership almost certainly asked the first question constantly. The record suggests nobody with enough authority was asking the second one loudly enough, early enough, for it to matter. There's a reason engineers and operations staff so often see a crisis like this coming well before leadership does. And it's not that leadership is uninterested in the details. It's that the people closest to a system's actual behavior under load are usually several organizational layers away from whoever has the authority to slow down a launch or delay a marketing push. And by the time a concern like that travels up through enough layers to reach a decision maker, the campaign is often already live. Shortening that distance, even informally, giving the engineers or operations lead in the room a real, standing voice in go or no-go decisions rather than an advisory one, is one of the more effective structural fixes available to a team that wants to avoid repeating Friendster's exact mistake. There's a final irony worth sitting within Friendster's story specifically. The company's own name, built around the idea of friends and genuine connection, became, for a huge number of its own users, synonymous with frustration and slow-loading pages during exactly the years it should have been cementing itself as the default place people went online. The brand and the daily experience of using it had quietly split apart from each other, and by the time anyone at the company treated that split as the actual emergency, competitors had already absorbed the very users Friendster had spent years earning in the first place. Every team currently celebrating a viral moment, a surprise feature in the press, or a sudden spike in signups is standing exactly where Friendster's leadership once stood, holding genuinely good news that has not yet been tested against the unglamorous systems required to actually deliver on it. The gap between those two things is where this entire story lives, and it's worth checking before it closes on its own. The hard way, in front of your own customers instead of your own engineers, on a timeline nobody in that celebratory meeting actually chose, or would have picked if they'd been asked in advance. Back when the good news still felt like nothing but good news worth celebrating without a second thought. Long before anyone sitting in that particular celebratory room had any real reason to imagine that the very same success they were happily toasting that day could, given enough time and enough additional scale, one day quietly become the actual underlying problem instead, in ways nobody in that specific room was ever positioned to see coming. Follow along for more of these.